Before rock and roll, there was rhythm and blues, but we aren't talking about that. Before rhythm and blues, there was jazz, but we aren't talking about that either. We are going to talk about rock and roll, its birth, and more notably, the death of rock and roll. When you think of the origins of rock and roll, depending on your age, some might be thinking of fucking Nickelback. If you're a little older, you may be even thinking of fucking Poison. And if you did or are, while I agree that those bands did their best to kill rock and roll, the truth is we've got to go way back before the Beatles, to someone who's never gonna go away, the man himself, Elvis Presley. It was 1955 when Elvis redefined American culture and brought rock and roll into the mainstream. Part of this success came from Elvis's abundance of talent, but I'd be negligent if I didn't mention rock and roll's rise, being amplified by America's success post-World War II, and the recent affordability of electronics entering the family living rooms in the form of television. As always, the youth of the day ran with it first in their efforts to distinguish themselves from previous generations. The sexual overtones, while controversial at the time, were mild by today's standards. Fast forward to the mid-60s and rock and roll was pushing new boundaries by growing more inclusive, with the embracing of the Beatles from across the pond and Jimi Hendrix showing it was crossing color barriers at home. It was also by the late 60s that rock and roll entered its second phase as new bands grew more political in tone while pushing the boundaries of what could be done, said, and performed on stage. Through rock and roll, society was gaining a consciousness that was as much reflected by its artists as it was dictated. Then came the 70s, and with it, rock and roll's transformation into a voice for the disenfranchised. Pissed off parents struggling to survive in a declining economy gave birth to pissed off teenagers who were leaving broken, intolerant, and abusive homes using music as their way to vent. With no internet at the time, the only collective echo chambers to vent in were the concert halls, with rock and roll as the unifying voice of the time. While rock splintered into punk, disco rose to prominence. The genre was largely a response to rock and roll's dominance, briefly replacing it in popularity as the new friendly voice. But disco's dramatic rise ended with an equally dramatic fall. The reason for that was the world around it. Disco was today's electronic dance music, insidious, self-absorbed, and largely oblivious to its surroundings. It was ahead of its time and simply couldn't survive the growing economic hardships developing around it. As mentioned previously, it wasn't just the music but also technological innovation that catapulted rock and roll. By the 80s, music had gone from albums to 8 tracks, tape, and CDs, and soon after the dramatic rejection of disco, as rock and roll was continuing to splinter into even more cultural subgenres, MTV arrived.
I want my MTV!
And it was with MTV that I'd argue the acceleration of rock and roll's eventual demise began. It's been said before, and I'll mention it now. We are visual creatures. The previous Music Is Not a Meritocracy video demonstrated what happens when people can see and examine performers up close. In 1955, with a small, low-resolution black and white television in some living rooms, there was still plenty left to the imagination. But by the 80s, with multiple colored televisions in every home throughout the modern world, MTV became to music what the rise of talkies were to silent movies. Few movie stars of the silent era survived the transition to talkies, and unfortunately, the rise of the music video seems to have negatively impacted music in a similar way. Because of this, a whole new generation of movie stars had to be created. With regards to music, the transition wasn't so dramatic, but in the end, the results were the same. By the mid-80s, rock and roll's mainstream heydays were behind it. For the most part, the majority of the music began following an all-too-familiar formula dictated by the marketing department. Bands released albums. These albums contained 8 to 12 songs, whether the band was a one-hit wonder or not. Amongst those songs was a ballad, no matter what style of band it was, and all of the songs had a prolonged guitar solo. Please bring those back, by the way. Despite all of this, the last truly great rock albums still managed to appear at the end, much like a bookend. If Elvis was on the left, Metallica was on the right, with the release of the Black Album in 1991. Metallica's Black Album wasn't just one of the last religious experiences of the rock and roll experiment, it also managed to have a lasting global impact like no other band has managed since. I know there are some who would argue that Nirvana's album Nevermind with the song Teen Spirit should be held in as high regard, but I disagree for a few reasons. First, the only reason people say this is because Metallica didn't die horrifically after the Black Album's release. Second, while it's true Nirvana ushered in the grunge era and they sorta gave a voice to its generation, the truth is also that Nirvana's success was in the selling of style, not substance. Grunge to me is the second last genre of rock and roll, an anti-mastery of the instrument punk extension whose greatest achievement was in the ending of the guitar solo. Grunge rejected newer and better for the sake of embracing average. Grunge was also one of the first signs of a new hypercultural trend emerging in society. Hyperculturalism being the rapid cycling of previous trends in an effort to appear different because it's grown hard to come up with anything new. While grunge worked well within past practices, it was the end of any effort to be better. The music was more introspective and observational in nature, just like society was beginning to become. Understand this isn't a condemnation. To be clear, I did and do enjoy some grunge music, but grunge is regressive in general. It leaned on nostalgia and rewarded difference for the sake of it. So, what's happened to rock and roll and the music industry since? Artistically, not much. The countercultural roots have been dropped as older anti-establishment bands sell their music to advertisers. Lip-syncing, drum samples, and auto-tune destroyed bands, but post-grunge is now just an expected part of the process. For example, Metallica of all bands, a band who got famous through tape trading, a band which used to brag about being different, took a huge shit on their legacy and everything they claimed to embody from 1981 to 1991 by filing suit against Napster in 2000. They've become the worst example of a genre that's given up on its core identity to completely sell itself out. Alternative rock has since replaced grunge and has been incorporating classical elements and orchestral themes into some of its mix, along with some pioneering work and mood-altering tones. But for the most part, while certainly worthy of respect, these efforts have had no impact in regaining mass-market global success. While it'll never go away, the fact is rock and roll will never rise to a fraction of the dominance it once had. It went from being friendly in the 50s to idealistic in the 60s, disillusioned by the 70s to frustrated and angry through the 80s and 90s, only to become soulless by 2000. Labels aren't looking or signing rock and roll bands. Today they push individual artists instead. Additionally, the crowded competition for attention has pushed music into being one element of a production versus being the production. Is there any other newish globally accepted rock and roll band other than the Foo Fighters touring right now? There are good bands doing good work, but the mainstream doesn't care beyond the level of a brief curiosity. The days of the rock stars, whether they be female like Janis Joplin and Joan Jett, or male like Jimi Hendrix, Freddie Mercury, or Slash, have been replaced by branded divas pushing out auto-tuned electronic dance music. The rise of digital media has crowded out all musical genres and had a regressive effect on the quality of music being monetized nowadays. Hyperculturalism's effect on music in the millennials generation seems a little unfortunate, to be honest. Few are looking to push boundaries, let alone improve things, not just in music, but in society in general. Many see a reversal in its worst, almost cartoonish form as some kind of justifiable retribution for perceived sins of the past. Music, much like society, seems to be aimless and eating its own at the moment, which is probably what the labels want anyway. Brainless consumers consuming brainless content.